Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Brooklyn History. My name is Marcia Eli. Happy 2025. Yes, this is our first program of the year. And it feels like it's really a special one, actually. And I have the great, fun privilege of greeting you on behalf of the entire Brooklyn Public Library, the Center for Brooklyn History, which is where we are, which is part of the public library, and my colleagues at BPL Presents, the Arts and Culture team of the library. So there's some irony in gathering in a place dedicated to stewarding the past for a talk about predicting the future. Yet there is truth that for all of history, human beings have tried to figure out what will happen next. As Glenn Adamson writes in the introduction to his book, A Century of Tomorrows, the long tradition of forecasting the future turns out to be, in retrospect, a fascinating way to understand the past. Tonight, we're honored to host Glenn and his conversation partner, Alexandra Lange, for a discussion about the layered insights in A Century of Tomorrows. In the book, Glenn examines 20th century futurologists, many of whom were well-known public intellectuals of their days, and he brings order to the chaos of competing visions for tomorrow, guiding us to understand that, as he writes, there is nothing straightforward about the history of the future. Process that for a minute. So copies of A Century of Tomorrow, as you probably saw as you came in, are available at our shop, at the CBH shop, and following the talk, Glenn will sign them in the front, up there. Before I introduce him and Alexandra more formally, and since we're talking about the future here, I want to tell you just a little bit about some of the things that are happening at CBH, the Center for Brooklyn History, and the Central Library branch at Grand Army Plaza. Here at CBH, next week and in the upcoming weeks, we have panels about the real work being done right now towards reparations for slavery in New York City and New York State. We'll be discussing Rikers Island with two men who co-authored a book about serving time there. In partnership with the Municipal Art Society, we'll be exploring the history and future of Atlantic Avenue. We're going to welcome former Congressman Ed Towns, whom some of you may remember, a legend. He just celebrated his 90th birthday, and he's going to discuss the history that he's witnessed. And down the road, we'll be hosting Roxane Gay and others. At Grand Army Plaza right now, we have an incredible exhibition called Turkey Saved My Life. It's photographs of James Baldwin, and next week there will be 4 films screened that are Baldwin related. I hope that you'll all sign up to get our newsletters so you can find out what's coming down the pike all through the year. Here you can pick up one of these that highlights what's happening here at CBH at the front desk. So now let me tell you a little bit more about our guests, and I'll invite them to come up in a minute. Glenn Adamson is a curator and cultural historian. His books include Craft and American History, Fewer Better Things, The Hidden Wisdom of Objects, and the Invention of Craft. His work has been published in Art in America, Antiques, Frieze, and elsewhere. He was previously director of the Museum of Arts and Design in New York, and has held appointments at the Yale Center for British Art and the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And Alexandra Lange is an architecture critic and the author of several books, including Meet Me by the Fountain and The Design of Childhood. Her writing has appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, New York Magazine, and The New York Times. She's been a featured writer at Design Observer, an opinion columnist at Dezeen, and the architecture critic for Curbed. She holds a PhD in 20th century architecture history from the Institute of Fine Arts in New York University, and has taught design criticism there, as well as at the School of Visual Arts. We are so excited to have you both here. Please help me welcome them to the stage.
So I feel like we're already being upstaged by a baked good. But since we both have an art history background, I think we're used to competing with like large images behind us on the screen. So it should all be fine. So welcome. It feels very appropriate to be doing this event on the first full week of the year, because if your media diet is anything like my media diet, you've just been inundated with predictions about the future. So many predictions. But I have to say that most of those predictions are only looking ahead to spring fashion, or what we're going to be eating in the fall, or like how your diet should go in the next month. So it was really a pleasure to dig into this book, which is talking about future in a much deeper way, in a past way, and in a way that I think can allow us to think about a farther future as well. So I was also fascinated that in one of those, let's say, shallow prediction events, on the last Sunday of 2024, the New York Times Style section published 12 predictions for life in 2025. And the cover image of the section was of a hand covered in mystic symbols holding a tarot card. And the tarot card they chose was the Magician. But your book also starts with the tarot, Glenn, and you chose a different card to kind of like launch your discussion of the future, which was the Wheel of Fortune. So can you talk a little bit about why you chose the Wheel of Fortune, and also, how tarot kind of gets us into this subject of the future?
Sure. Thanks, Alexandra. Great to have you here. Thanks so much for doing this. And thanks to everyone for coming. It's so great to see all these friends in the room. And we will get back to the baked good at the end. I'm just going to let you wonder about it for now. So the tarot, which does seem to be everywhere these days, there's even an exhibition coming up about it in London where I'm living at the moment. It seemed to me like the perfect place to start. I'd had a little bit of a direct experience with it, had a couple of readings. And it struck me when I was going through that experience that what I had expected to be about the future was really almost like a therapy session. It was very, very much about present tense me and where I was at. So the exercise is really about thinking about directions of travel that lie ahead of you and asking yourself which of them you would like to pursue, and also why it is that those are the possibilities that lie in front of you. So the Wheel of Fortune, I suppose, in a rather obvious way, had to do with that question of chance and accidental futures happening to you as compared with the future that you could actually create for yourself. And that kind of polarity is really bound up in the tarot. There was actually another card I was very interested in, which I also mentioned, which is the Fool. And if you know the tarot deck, you'll know that the Fool is gaily about to sail off of a cliff and plunged presumably to her demise. Very interestingly, and I mentioned this in the conclusion, when Greta Thunberg was made Person of the Year a couple of years ago by Time magazine, the image that they created of her happened by chance or not to look exactly like the composition of the Fool card in the tarot. So it seemed like some kind of nascent commentary about climate change. So the idea that the tarot contains this historical material that would allow us to think through our own futures and is effectively really a diagnostic tool for engaging with the present, that was, for me, the perfect start.
Yeah. I like the idea of the tarot as kind of a game, and it got me thinking about kind of our first encounters, like our encounters as young people with ideas of the future. And I was trying to think, okay, look, what was the first like predictive item that I encountered. And I realized that it was the magic 8-ball, which I think all of you have probably also encountered. And the magic 8-ball is kind of perfect, like as a design object, but also I think in the way that a lot of predictive mechanisms kind of soft pedal things, right? I mean, there's only one really like bad thing contained in the magic 8-ball, like only one, like, I can't even remember how it's phrased. It's like, not a chance or something like that. It kind of lets you down easy. And I wondered if you had like a childhood prediction experience, futurology experience like that.
It's such a great example to the Magic 8-Ball because it's not a box because it's round, but it's a black box technology and you don't really understand how it works, or at least I don't. It's this thing floating in fluid, right? And so it's a perfect material expression of this idea of speculation. And I suppose it's also a reference to the crystal ball, must be, as in John Dee and, alchemical or astrological future telling. I guess what would my own first encounter of the future have been? I think it probably was like a guidance counselor, in junior high school, telling me that, I'd be a good, chef or what. I can't remember what they told me, but I feel like the way that you encounter the future when you're young is extremely personal. And what I was interested in, of course, in this book is the social dimension of the future. So the big future, long timescales, and also large cultural footprint. But of course, that bigger futurological experience is always bound up with the individual futurological experience.
Yeah. I mean, talking about the tarot and then the magic 8-ball, in your acknowledgments, you mentioned that this book started as an exhibit that you proposed during your time at the V&A Museum. And I wondered if there were more kind of specific objects from either the distant past or the more recent past that you were thinking about having in that exhibition, maybe that served kind of as like totems for your various chapter, perhaps the geodesic dome.
Yeah, so Buckminster Fuller definitely is hard to avoid in the topic, but I would go much further back and talk about, for example, the Last Judgment paintings that were popular in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And in fact, that was one area where this show that I had hoped to do at the Victoria and Albert Museum a long time ago did influence the book. So the first chapter is called Heaven and Hell, and it's really about the way that religious or prophetic conceptions of the future tend to force us or lead us into these polar oppositional ways of thinking about the future. In other words, it's either going to be heaven or hell, utopia or dystopia, perfection or damnation, whatever your preferred dialectic would be. And that's so beautifully represented in a Last Judgment image because you have the all-father, all-powerful deity lifting some people up and sending other people down. And it struck me that, sort of spoiler alert for our conversation, but the structure of the book really maps 20th century futurology from that kind of oppositional or dualistic way of thinking about possible futures to, thank you, that's for you folks over there. Thank you very much. To our present day situation where I see a similar kind of diametric opposition, and moreover, I think people have a tendency to think about the future in rather nuanced, non-gray area ways. In other words, one party represents some kind of salvation, perhaps, but for sure the other one represents some kind of hellfire. And so for me, the fact that we would still be operating within a conceptual matrix that was already available to the Middle Ages is deeply worrying. And what I was really trying to do in the book, if I did anything, was to show that in the 20th century you had this incredibly vital, volatile, but also extremely provocative range of future speculation strategies that we could return to and learn from, instead of having this kind of either my way or the highway attitude that we seem to have today.
Yeah, so the first chapter is really about the more distant past. And then in chapter 2, you sort of take up the 20th century conception of the future. And that chapter is called Machine. Can you talk about how in that chapter you discuss how futurology becomes professionalized? Like it goes from being like the province of mystics to something that, people in suits in Midtown are going to take up.
Yeah, so just to say quickly about the structure of the book, there's a chapter called Heaven and Hell, and there's a pair of chapters called Machine and Garden, which both look at the 20s and 30s and are kind of opposed to one another. Then there's another pair of chapters called The Lab and the Party, which is the kind of post-war period. Those, again, it's a kind of active pairing. And then the last chapter is called The Flood. Well, maybe we'll get to that. And that's the kind of onrushing, way too much future, the future of future shock, if you know that book. So the machine chapter is the one where I really talk about the professionalization of futurology, as you say. And maybe the most obvious example here would be the industrial designer. So if you have one image in your head, and it's in fact on the cover of the book, of what the future looks like, it might be Metropolis, the Fritz Lang film, or it might be the Futurama from the 1939-1940 World's Fair by Norman Bel Geddes. But at any rate, it's almost bound to be streamlined. So it's this idea of an object or a vehicle or possibly even a building that seems to be leaning forward temporally, trying to arrive at the future faster than all of its less exciting, less marketable competitors. And so that aesthetic is paired with the emergence of what I would describe as professional futurology. Another great example of this would be trend forecasting, which is a more female-dominated discipline, as opposed to industrial design, very male-dominated in its early years, but is otherwise very, very similar in its strategies and its imprint on the culture. If anything, it's more successful than industrial design in driving the industries where it's active, which is to say, especially fashion, of course, anything with colors, like appliances, to some extent cars, to some extent Hollywood. And these figures like Margaret Rourke Hayden really exert an incredibly powerful influence on those sectors. And they have this, in retrospect, I think we have to sort of look at them in amazement for having the way that they thought of this. They actually invented self-fulfilling prophecy, arguably for the first time in human history, in the sense that they would predict that, let's say, next year's colors would be avocado and burnt sienna, and then lo and behold, they would be. Well, why was that? Because they had these trend reports and newsletters that they were sending out to all of their industrial clients saying these will be the colors. Then, of course, they were, because they were being listened to. So it was a very self-conscious strategy of specifying a future, and by the very act of specifying it, making it happen. And I argue that that moment of professionalization then has a huge influence on the culture at large, and it creates a kind of legitimacy for futurology that it never had before, because previously, obviously, a prediction based on, let's say, astrology just had no kind of predictive or truth-telling capability, whereas this kind of bureaucratic futurology did.
So the sort of frenzy over the Pantone color of the year is really like operating on that model from the 20s?
Yeah, it's a 100-year-old strategy, which I did not know. There's a great scholar called Reggie Blasek.
Oh, yeah.
Who's done a great book on this. So I learned most of what I know about it from her work, but it does go back to 100 years ago. And what's also very interesting is that it's a very American phenomenon. The reason being that the Americans were trying to steal a march on, or at least carve away some of the marketplace dominance from the French. So it was also a kind of industrial espionage. So the trends forecasters would send people over to Paris to see what was going to happen in the new couture seasons, and then they would take that back and apply it to all these different areas of industrial production.
Cool. Well, you already brought this up a little, but I mean, you have these sort of paired chapters, but then within the structure of the chapters, I think you often have sort of like oppositional categories as well. And one of those that really interested me was that of gender, sort of like how does the future that people are trying to sell to women like look a little different than the future they're trying to sell to men. And I wondered if you would just talk a little bit about some of those figures that were thinking either implicitly or explicitly about like gendered futures.
Yeah, sure. So there's, I suppose the big variable that we have to introduce here to think about gender is scale, because the parameters within which women were able to be futurologists in the early 20th century were, of course, constrained by the same logic of domesticity that women's other activities were. And there were very limited pathways that didn't go through the home. So this is obviously the moment when home economics is taking off, for example. And female led futurology is running along a kind of parallel pathway. So you might think about someone like Christine Fredericks, who was the person who actually formulated the idea of planned obsolescence, although she didn't call it that quite. But the idea that a company would be staging a series of annual releases of a particular product along model lines, which of course we associate with the auto industry. And she was looking at that closely, but applying it to other sectors as well. You also might think about Charlotte Perkins Gilman, the author of Herland, which is a radical utopia, the utopian novel that has, introduces the reader to an all-female society. What's interesting about that novel is that it features a kind of science fiction element, which is parthenogenesis. Well, it features several sci-fi elements, but the one that's really salient is the idea that women could give birth without men being involved. So the technical term for this is parthenogenesis. And to a remarkable degree, that actually sort of dug into the mindset of feminist theorists for generations. And in fact, Shulamith Firestone's incredible book, Dialectic of Sex, which is published in the early 70s, features an extraordinary kind of coda where she talks about her ideals for a future society. What would it really look like to have a gender equality in the society? And she says you can't have that if women are relegated to being the ones doing childbirth, because it's too much of a disadvantage in every respect. And so she says basically we have to commit the resources of the military-industrial complex to solving the problem of how you give birth to babies in test tubes, right? And it's like, why haven't we done that? Here we are 60 years later, and in a way her point still stands. And it's a great example of how feminist futurology enters the project of radicalization of society from a totally different point of view, from the more industrial or machinic futures that you would see in, let's say, Russian constructivism or the industrial designers. And yet it seems, to me at least, that it's much more provocative looking at it in retrospect, largely because those options were not taken up by capitalized entities.
Why don't you just talk a little, just like sort of as the counter example, about the Futurama and Norman Bell Geddes, since that is, well, sort of the look of the cover of your book is very much of that era, and I think people sort of subconsciously like have like Bell Geddes streamlining, et cetera, in their heads. What was Bell Geddes' vision, let's say the masculinist industrial design vision?
Yeah, I would love to hear your take on the Futurama, because it's such an important architectural history moment as well. I guess my take on it would be that it's almost like a movie that you sit inside, and famously it has a people mover. Does everyone know what we're talking about? The Futurama from 1939 and 40. So it was the most popular exhibit at the World's Fair, and I think it was seen by something like 12 million people, if I'm remembering rightly.
Yeah, and it was in this huge sort of white, streamlined barn, essentially, and people could snake up the front. So even the line had a certain amount of drama, and then you would get inside and sit in a seat, and it would sort of sweep you around over this giant, I can't remember the square footage, giant model of what the U.S. would look like in the 1960s. And I wrote about it in my book on the shopping mall, because Victor Gruen, the father of the shopping mall, was one of the people who worked on this model. And like one of the principal features of the model is 14-lane highways. So it was very much like car-centered, sprawling, skyscrapers in one place, like spread out housing in another, vision of the future. And it was also in this kind of like mechanized, like car type building.
And it was funded by General Motors. I don't think I said that. So
yes,
that's
and it was sponsored by
fact.
General Motors. So, but this is also maybe an example of, sorry, I've forgotten what you said, but of, kind of like making the future happen. Or General Motors was hoping to make everybody crave cars even more after they saw the Futurama.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So it's a perfect example of that. That idea that if you put a compelling enough future in front of people, that they actually will seize it and build it. And of course, this is what science fiction ends up contesting and creating this kind of dark mirror, critical version. Can we also use that same strategy for the purposes of critique? But at this moment of onset in the 1930s, it's a very affirmative, positivistic mode that, of course, you ultimately see realized in Tomorrowland at Disneyland, and then Disney World to take the most obvious examples, Epcot Center. So it's a very, very powerful, and I would say in some ways dominant way of thinking about futurology from the 30s, at least till the 60s, when, as we'll probably get to, the shit hits the fan.
Yeah, and I did want to ask you, because like another thing sort of that keeps coming up, like this is a book that sort of goes along, and there are a lot of examples, but there are certain sort of loops that appear from chapter to chapter, which are very nice to pick up, like the loop of gender, or then also like the loop of science fiction. Like you've also already talked about kind of like early 20th century science fiction and then like 1970s science fiction. But I was particularly interested in like an incident that you mentioned in the late 1960s in which the editor of Galaxy magazine asked readers to write in with their predictions for the future. And this was sort of under the like general category of thinking that maybe the readers of a fiction magazine would like be as knowledgeable about the future as the futurologists or the scientists, that somehow like science fiction people would have already cracked the code. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that and like how science fiction is fitting in these different decades.
Yeah. So this is an undertaking of somebody called Judith Merrill, who is a very interesting science fiction author, not very well remembered today, unfortunately, but one of the really compelling figures in the history of science fiction in the 50s and 60s. And what she and some colleagues did was to invite the readers of Galaxy magazine to propose solutions for the Vietnam War. And she also, intriguingly, asked science fiction writers to vote as to whether they were in favor of the war continuing or whether the United States should be suing for peace. And this is, I think, in 1969. So the war is really at its height. So all the Isaac Asimov, Frederick Pohl, all these, you get to see where they stand on the war at that time. Very fascinating document just in that respect. But I was particularly interested in the way that the readership, some of whom, by the way, were actually soldiers in Vietnam, reading the science fiction pulp magazine and then writing back their answers, which is an amazing idea. They would actually make suggestions as to how to solve the war or how to bring the war to an end, which I think my favorite example is each side calls for voluntary suicides, and whoever has more suicides wins. It's like very powerful, dark, very sci-fi. It's like you can like feel the short story, right, in that idea. But I guess what struck me was that the kind of poignancy of that being such a misapplication of science fiction thinking, because when you try to bring science fiction into the present and get that way of analyzing things, that kind of wild, imaginative set of metrics, or a kind of anti-metrical thinking, and apply it to a real-world present-day problem, it's like its virtues vaporize and it comes to seem very superficial. Like the examples you were giving at the beginning, it sort of descends to the level of, what color will our tea cozies be by spring, and the kind of, I don't know, the sadness of that, or the tragedy of science fiction being unable to really implement its incredible charisma and all the compelling things about it and actually become a present-day instrument. That to me is a real kind of lesson of the book, that if you put too much pressure on the act of futurology and try to get it to be an instrumental tool rather than a mechanism of imaginary liberation, then you are in some way misusing it. And of course, we have a lot of examples of that, which we can get into, of precisely where that instrumentalization has led.
Yeah. I mean, did you feel like you needed kind of like the pressure release of like, let me think about objects for a little bit, or let me think about science fiction for a little bit, or let me think about like actual sort of more scientized futurology, like from time to time? Just, because some of these examples can be really bleak or really frustrating. And so being able to kind of move between the modes of thought about the future, like, was that helpful?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's also just a level of competency there, because I'm trained as a design historian and a curator. So when I would go too far away, like there's a section in the book about, I hope this doesn't put you all off from buying it, but there's a section about insurance. And in a way, if you think about it, like what's the most important futurological industry? Well, the insurance industry. And also you can't really have capitalism without insurance. And in some funny way, it's a book about capitalism because what does capitalism do? It's about return on investment, which means that capitalism essentially is a futurological enterprise at its core, right back to the 17th century Dutch ships being sent to Asia, and which is where we get the insurance industry, right? So those two things are absolutely bound up with one another. And the question of who decides how policies are written, who gets them, of course, that's racially inflected, gender inflected. Yeah, so the kind of contestation within the insurance industry was very interesting to me, for example, or the way that Robert McNamara, who was a kind of trained futurologist from Harvard, did more than anybody else to get the US into Vietnam and keep them there. You know, those kinds of stories I felt like absolutely had to be in the book, but I also felt like I was getting way out of my comfort zone in writing those sections. And frankly, if you write a book about the future that isn't fun, and doesn't capture the kind of insanity and, I don't know, there's just something so human about the way that people think about the future and allow themselves scope to be absurd that I really wanted to draw out. Like that in a way is what I love about it. That's why I wanted to write the book. And while it's obviously, it couldn't be a more serious topic, right? What is our future going to be like? And it's gotten more and more serious all the time, arguably. I still think there's something about the inherent, also just the sort of human comedy of all of us wanting to know so badly what's going to happen and never knowing. And every minute that comes along, every day, every week, every month, every year, every decade, every century that comes along, we still don't know what's going to happen, right? It's like we're trapped in this state of epistemological vagueness, and we're trying to fill that hole however we can. And so there's something almost kind of Shakespearean in that, and it makes me think not just of the Hamlets and Macbeths and Lady Macbeths, it also makes me think of the clowns and the Falstaffs, you know?
The Fool. Yeah, that actually leads into like one of the nice things about reading a book that's mostly located in the 20th century is that like at a certain point, for most of us, I think, in this room, you eventually catch up to your own memories. And so for me, like reading along, like the first sort of person I remembered from my childhood that you mentioned as a futurologist was Faith Popcorn, who is this obviously she gave herself her own name, like a new name. She's like a really famous pop futurologist from the 1980s. And I think you told me when we were chatting before this that your sort of like catching up to yourself memory was of the famous like 1984 Apple Macintosh commercial. And I think actually those two like sort of moments, figures are a good kind of like heaven and hell opposition potentially. But could you talk like first a little bit about Faith Popcorn, who I see as very much in the mode of influencers today?
Yeah. So does anybody remember Faith Popcorn? A couple of people. So I pick on her quite severely, I have to admit, as well as the author of this incredibly bad book called Megatrends. So I kind of pair them as like just ridiculous, like futurology gone really wrong in the 1980s. And one of the really fun things about Faith Popcorn is that she had these incredibly memorable, very marketable future predictions that were also completely wrong, of which the most famous is cocooning. So if you've heard this term, that's originally a sort of neologism, I believe, of hers. And she predicted that in the 90s, people would be retreating into their homes and sort of building nests for themselves, I guess because life was hard. And in fact, of course, exactly the opposite happened, but she just gaily went along and talked about cocooning anyway, and how it was, you know, so it's like prediction, it's almost the opposite of what the self-fulfilling prophecy strategy of the 1920s had been intended to do. It's like the data points become so complex and so numerous and so multivalent that futurologists begin to take leave of any kind of truth and any kind of accountability. So they just claim that they were right. This should start to sound familiar, right? As like, how do we get to where we are now? So the kind of fake news, big lie, all that stuff we talk about all the time, you can really see that starting to originate in this period that I call the flood, the over provision of possible futures. And there was a great book written by a guy called William Sheridan called The Fortune Sellers, where he takes aim at popcorn and other futurologists for this, and I use that as a kind of lens into that story. But then you also asked about the 1984 ad.
Yeah.
And again, I'm curious, do people remember this ad? It's Ridley Scott. So it's around the time he's making Blade Runner. And the ad was for the launch of the new Apple Mac. And it was aired during the Super Bowl in January of 1984. So how many people saw it? Like 40% of the American population saw this ad, right? And it's shockingly a 1 minute long piece of footage that takes George Orwell's 1984 kind of via Pink Floyd's The Wall and turns it into an ad for Steve Jobs' Apple, right? So it takes this intense critical dystopian text and transforms it just like that into this piece of whatever the opposite of agitprop is, right? Just pure capitalist propaganda. And that's the first, you asked earlier, what's my first memory of the future? And that actually probably is it, because I remember.
I think it's actually creativity. It's capitalist creativity propaganda,
Yeah, there
which
you
is
go.
like extra insidious.
Yeah, exactly. So, I was just thinking back to that. I was also, in fact, the passage where I talk about that ad is the first time in the book that I used first person. In other words, starting a sentence with I, because I was very interested in I was writing about postmodernism, so it felt like the right thing to do, I guess. But I remember that and just feeling like, oh, am I that drone behind the computer? Or am I, the sort of Olympian athlete that throws the hammer and smashes the screen with Big Brother, So it's a really, to me, it's still a very provocative watch. And you can see it on YouTube if you haven't seen it.
Yeah, I actually rewatched it after we were talking about it, and I was like, oh, wow, yes. So you mentioned this a few times, this concept of the flood, which is sort of how you think we're dealing with the future today. And I actually, there was a paragraph, hold on.
We got into the live reading stage of the proceedings, Alexandra.
There's a paragraph on page 250 where you talk about mega trends and the flood that I just thought kind of summed it up. So you don't have to read it, or you could read it and then just sort of like explicate it a bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's see. This is this bad book that I talked about earlier called Megatrends, which was published in the 80s. And I write, for all its glaring faults, Megatrends still needs to be taken seriously. It marks an important moment in the history of futurology, in that it was the harbinger of many other equally dumbed-down books about the future, usually aimed at the self-help or business markets, a publishing phenomenon that continues to this day, as a visit to any airport bookstore will confirm. This superficiality is nothing new. Most of the responses to Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, which was the big utopian novel of the late 19th century, of course, 1888, had been equally reductive, but books only become sensations for a reason. The appetite for this simplistic pseudoscience was driven by the same conditions that postmodern artists, writers, and musicians were responding to, the much too muchness that I'm calling the flood. The insistence on making the future legible was perfectly attuned to its particular moment. So there, I guess what I was thinking about was this this much too muchness, which Heidi and Alvin Toffler famously called it future shock. That in the same way that you would have culture shock if you went to a country where you didn't speak the language, you would have future shock if you found yourself in a temporal construct for which you weren't prepared. And the idea of acceleration, speed, what the theorist David Harvey called time-space compression. In other words, your experiential relationship to space and time gets tighter and tighter, more and more constricted, more and more compressed. All of these forces tend to paradoxically generate a huge flurry of futurological activity and also a total lack of confidence in the verifiability or real value of that activity. And that postmodern flood has washed us into the condition that we're now in. So in a way, I kind of signed the book off at around the year 2000, apart from the epilogue, because it seemed to me that whatever your crisis of choice would be, whether it's the Trump administration or climate change or the kind of conflict around identity politics that we're currently experiencing, a lot of those things can be explicated by understanding that flood dynamic. And I also think that looking at the future as a particular variable within that postmodern flood is an especially telling aspect of what it's done to us as a culture.
So, I mean, so what do you think the state of futurology is now? Like, sort of how do we see, how is futurology packaged for us now in this flood state?
Well, that's of course the big question, and because I'm a historian, I always get very nervous, like certainly ironically talking about the future or even the now, because I feel like I need to go and do a bunch of reading, and it'll be too late by the time I come back and tell you. But I guess the way I would answer that question would be to say that it's become, like everything else, compartmentalized. So I think that happens in a number of different ways. It certainly happens by sector, and this is, or industry, and this is one area where this book, although in some ways it's like a mirror image of my writing on craft, it operates in relation to a very similar dynamic in that material intelligence, as I call it, has gotten carved up into these narrow channels. And so there's a real feeling that people these days don't really understand how the world around them is made, or how it works, how anything works, the technology, how are the tables made, how is this building made? Well, it's from the 1880s, so I guess we know that. But anything that's new presents itself to us in this kind of mysterious guise, even though obviously our collective material intelligence is greater than it ever has been, because otherwise we couldn't be doing all these amazing things, like making gingerbread geodesic domes. But individually, we seem to have lost our purchase on that material intelligence. And I think the same thing is true of the future. In other words, it's become compartmentalized into these specialist arenas, and we lack a kind of larger scale confidence about the future of the kind that people had in the 1930s, 50s, 60s, which was partly perilous and partly exciting and thrilling. We haven't even talked about the counterculture, but that would be another great example. We have a very widely shared, not pervasive, but still very widely shared idea of the future fueled by drugs, not incidentally, that has a real impact. And right now what I see is a kind of fragmentation of the future. And then paradoxically, in combination with that, you have this return of the dynamic that I mentioned at the beginning, a kind of oppositional heaven versus hell, me versus you, my future versus yours dynamic. And I would characterize the combination of those two things, the specialist walling off of future narratives on the one hand, and the opposition, both of which basically had to do with lack of shared narratives about the future that we were all excited about. I would characterize that as extremely toxic. And so in a lot of ways, my book is trying to push against that situation and offer, as I said, these models from the past that maybe we could return to in one way or another.
Yeah. Well, if we want to end my part of questioning on a more positive note, perhaps, then yeah, I mean, you do have a chapter called The Party, which is mostly about the counterculture. So which party did you research? Sounded like the best idea.
Yeah, so, and I should say Mark Derry is here. I don't know where Mark is, but Mark was a very influential writer, a great writer on futurology. And he is, in fact, the person who coined the term Afrofuturism in 1993, right, Mark? And that was a very important touchstone for me. And here I'm thinking not just about science fiction writers like Octavia Butler, who might or might not be an Afrofuturist, but certainly Samuel Delany is often talked about in that way and was, part of the text in which Mark coined the term. But also thinking about, musicians like Sun Ra. So that was a very important arena of kind of jubilant thinking otherwise, but of course very much based on a kind of working through of the traumatic origins of Black culture and the way that that's been transmuted into these other forms, but still had that kind of trauma present within it. So very powerful set of narratives there. And then I was also thinking a lot about queer futurology. And so I happen to be working on a big project about Keith Haring right now, for example. And if you think about it, Keith Haring, it's all, spaceships and TVs and zapping lightning bolts, right? So his iconography is in some ways like ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. And in some ways it's like the cover of a science fiction novel. And that the kind of co-presence of past and present that you have with someone like Sun Ra, the very name, obviously this Neo-Egyptian iconography. And then you would have someone like George Clinton from Parliament Funkadelic coming down in the spaceship, right? And Sun Ra saying that he's actually experienced life on another planet briefly. And then similarly, you have Haring throwing these parties in the midst of the AIDS crisis, which have this similar quality of being both ancient and futurological. I just think all of that has so much kind of combustible, dynamic, explosive content in it. And so for me, that unleashed futurology that you have in a moment of shared jubilation and the kind of dissolution of the self into the collective, and that idea of letting the future happen rather than directing it by force or by fiat, that remains super inspiring to me.
Great. Well, I think, is it time for audience questions? Yes. Okay. I think we have people with microphones roving around. If you want to raise your hand and ask Glenn a question.
Thanks. Hi, I'm AJ. Thank you for giving this talk. I wrote down a number of questions, but I'm just going to ask one. But I had to write them down as I was going. I was curious as to how come like futurist aesthetics today feel like super homogenized in that like everything is just glass. Like even if I'm thinking of things that feel ahead of that, it kind of circles back into feeling retro again, as if there's like no way forward from glass in so many ways.
Yeah, that's such a great comment. Do I agree with that? I think I basically agree with that. Do you agree with that, Alexandra?
Yeah, I mean, it's like in the business, we talk about everything looking like an Apple store. It's like the Apple store kind of like claimed like what future high-tech things would look like, and everybody just started imitating it rather than coming up with their own different alternatives.
Yeah, I think it's partly that, but it's also, I mean, why does that work so well, and why does it seem to shut down possibility as much as it does? And if you just think about your iPhone, obviously I have one because who doesn't, right? I mean, what does it look like? It's like the void in my hand, right? And then it turns on. But when you pull it out, that blackness and the kind of that feeling of the infinite well that you can disappear into, which is of course tantamount to the kind of transmutation of value into information or experience rather than physicality, and lots of other changes that we could mention. I think this is where Stanley Kubrick's 2001, I talk about that a lot in the book, and it's a very problematic film in lots of ways, but that black monolith and its visual relationship to the iPhone and the sense of both of them being a kind of blank space or a void space into which we might project, to me it feels like just the most massive shared delusional admission of defeat, right? So the idea that your phone, again, this is coming from a craft historian too, so consider the source, but the idea that your phone would be the universal tool and you wouldn't need another one really, or it would be the one tool to bind them all, like the ring in Lord of the Rings. That just it does seem like a kind of dreadfully effective move that's been made that we don't seem to be able to come up with a response to, you know? And I really feel like, you know, obviously it is the most significant product design of the 21st century so far, and the way that it's the kind of wasteland of the imagination that it's created while claiming to unleash the imagination is really something to behold. So that would be my take on it from a purely aesthetic point of view.
I'm not sure how to ask this question, so I'm just going to throw it out. I actually came tonight because I'm terrified of the future. And I'm looking forward to reading your book because maybe I'd be less terrified. But I have to throw, because you mentioned sci-fi, and right now we have a very powerful person in this world who goes by a sci-fi playbook. And I felt, it feels to me like the elephant in every room that I'm in. So I just want to get your take on Musk, the future, and how we're going to survive it.
I love thinking about him as the elephant in the room now that he's a Republican and proud. That's funny. Yeah, I mean, first, maybe I'll start with one fun fact, which is that Musk's, is it grandfather? Anyway, one of his ancestors was the head of Technocracy Inc. in Canada. Do you know about this? So one of his direct ancestors, a couple of generations back, was part of this absolutely bizarre kind of cult of technology and what you might call kind of logical positivism as applied to government. So the idea was that democracy be damned, everything can be handed over to experts, and they can just drive the economy and everything else in it. It was sort of like a capitalist version of centralized communism, maybe one way of thinking about it, and emerging at the same time as Soviet communism. So that tells you a lot right there. Obviously, he's not his ancestors, and he's got a lot of other things in his ideology, that kind of toxic stew with Ayn Rand of Fountainhead fame being the other most obvious ingredient. But there's absolutely no question that he does come across, I think, very self-consciously as a science fiction villain, and that there's no way of controlling the effect of science fiction. I mean, as I said before, it's very charismatic, very compelling, and there's no way of controlling the effects that those texts will have when they're released into the wilds. And if you look not just at Musk, but also at the Silicon Valley ideological complex generally, it's amazing the degree to which it seems to have been derived from post-war science fiction, without any of the people involved seeming to have noticed any of the critical aspects of those sources. So from a purely historiographical point of view, I totally object to that sort of style of thinking. What will actually happen as a result of his supposed involvement in governance? I mean, what do I know? I imagine that he wants to do to the government what he did to Twitter. So what will that look like in practice? How effective will he be in trying to dismantle something of that scale as opposed to a little kind of postage stamp enterprise like Twitter was in the grand scheme of things? Just really hard to say. But I would say you're not wrong to be worried. However, as I said, I do also think that, at least having written the book, I find there's lots of reasons. There are reasons or bases on which you could construct a kind of optimistic set of expectations about what might happen, not in the next 4 years, but let's say in the next 40. Because if you look at the book, or if you look anyway at the history that I try to traverse in the book, I think what you see is a lot of reversal and tremendous unexpected swerves of energy and capital, actually, into places that you would not have expected them to go, precisely around these energies that I'm describing as futurological. And I mean, hopefully this conversation is giving you some of the texture of that and how complex it is. But I think the idea that one person or even a cabal of particularly malignant people could really grab the future by the scruff of the neck and force it to do what they want is disproven by everything that we know about the history of the future. So I can't say what will happen, but I can say for damn sure it's not what Musk thinks is going to happen, which is some comfort.
So Elon Musk aside, what do you think is a 2025 trend or prediction that's going to totally fall flat and be a future embarrassment?
Yeah, see, there you're trying to get me involved in futurology, which I sort of feel like I always want to bring down the blast shield and say that's not my department. I don't know, Alexandra, do you have one? You're better at following the reports than I am, I feel like.
I was so glad when I stopped working for a magazine that made me make up trends.
Yeah.
I actively resist that.
I will.
I will say that, Pantone color of the year for 2025 is this horrible brown color. And I don't think that's going to happen at all.
Yeah, but they're very good at that kind of engineering still.
I don't know. Last year, I have strong opinions about colors.
This reminds me. We have a mutual friend called Sarah Archer who once wrote an article. I think it's for Hyperallergic. It's a review of The Americans. You remember that spy TV show, The Americans? And her article is about the production design of the show, and it's called 50 Shades of Beige. which is like, oh man, I wish I had thought of that. But she's now working on the bicentennial. So one thing I can say is that in 2026, there's going to be this big question of what happens when we get to the 250th anniversary of the country, and how is it like and not like what happened in 1976, and that has every chance of falling flat because of circumstances. So what I would say is that you're going to have people from a certain point of view predicting a kind of return to patriotism, and I think it's going to seem so hollow and inadequate compared to what happened even 50 years ago, that itself is going to be a kind of tremor in the force, culturally speaking. And I'm quite interested in that. Sarah's even more interested than I am, but I think that's a really fascinating kind of cultural history, slice of cultural history that's coming right around the bend.
Thanks. So listening to you, I was thinking that when I was a kid in the 80s, the threat of nuclear annihilation was on everybody's mind. And since then, it's not as though the risk of nuclear war has abated completely, but we don't talk about it as much. And so I was wondering what you think are some of the areas that we're no longer, we can think about how we think about the future, but the things we're not thinking about is almost as telling in some way. So I wonder, what are some of the things we're not thinking about as much that characterize this era?
Yeah, I'm so glad you pointed that out. And if the shadow of the bomb is so formative for the post-war futurological complex in so many ways, science fiction included, by the way. So that's a really important one. And of course, this is kind of not what you're asking about, but we haven't mentioned artificial intelligence. But that's another thing that I track back actually to the 19th century and Samuel Butler's amazingly prescient essay, Darwin Among the Machines, which was published, I think, in the 1860s, which was basically already talking about the dangers of artificial intelligence. So you have certain concerns that seem to rise and fall into public consciousness. And right now, AI is the one. But then you wonder, as you say, what are the things that we're not thinking about? So, I don't know, water shortage, for example, or food security, things that probably have more boring answers and more boring sounding problems, and don't kind of capture the imagination because they lack that sci-fi contextualization. But I think that's another problem, and maybe a critique you could make of the argument in my book, frankly, which is, I'm saying that futurology has this potentially liberatory character because it can present a future to you in a guise that encourages you to think differently about the present, and that can be very politically efficacious. But obviously what that means in turn, like I was joking about earlier with the insurance industry, is that something that's impervious to that kind of narrativization doesn't do as well if futurology is the tool that you want to use. So I think we do have to be aware of that and not be kind of overly seduced by the more diverting and kind of compelling aspects of the story that I'm trying to tell.
I feel like that's the faith popcorn lesson. Like,
totally.
if you say it like loudly and with enough kind of rhetorical flair, like people are going to believe you.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I think it's like anything else, though. I mean, I spent my whole career. We have Elisa Authors here too, as the chief curator at the Museum of Arts and Design, so my former institution, and we talk about this all the time. Is like we're all for craft up to a point, because once it starts to curdle into a kind of caricature of itself, it starts to become extremely regressive. And if you start thinking of craft as the answer to anything, then you clearly haven't thought in a complex enough way about the problem. And I think exactly the same thing is true of futurology. Keith Haring, great, Sun Ra, great, but I honestly would not really have wanted Keith Haring to be president. Like it's not a universal solution, as wonderful as he was. And actually that reminds me, Sun Ra once did a little short video where he stood in front of the White House and he said, "I'm looking across the street and I don't see the Black House." It's like an amazing moment. But I think if we have to think of futurology as a kind of somewhat overlooked cultural device with incredible potential for the future that we actually have in front of us, while also being very wary of it. And maybe that's the kind of balance I was trying to strike in the book.
question. One more question.
Marvelous talk, Glenn. Just a quick question. I know that you end your timeline at 2000, but I wonder if you could just speak briefly to the widespread notion at the bottom of the socioeconomic pyramid, and also just more generally among what was once called the middle class before it went extinct, which is the idea of what Mark Fisher, the cultural theorist, called the slow cancellation of the future, often paired with his notion hauntology, the idea that the present is haunted by the specters of lost tomorrows or utopian roads never taken. Simon Reynolds calls this retromania, the kind of autophagy and self-cannibalization of a postmodern culture that is just looting and pillaging past styles and regurgitating them. And you have to juxtapose that with, at the top of the Tyrrell pyramid from Blade Runner, you know, there's Elon Musk, who's dreaming of terraforming Mars and creating weird Hot Wheels cars that look like Darth Vader and a stealth bomber had a baby, you know. So there's this really radical disjuncture between, you know, Abu Dhabi princelings and penthouses who are still allowed utopian dreams, and the rest of us who feel like we're picking our way through a debris field of broken tomorrows that never arrived. I know the book ends at 2000, but can you dilate on that thought for a moment?
Yeah, that was amazing dilation. That's the aforementioned Mark Derry asking the question. Thank you, Mark. So, yeah, what to say about that? I think we've maybe tangentially at least glanced across some of that when we were talking about the iPhone, for example, maybe when talking about Musk, and the idea of futurology as something that can be centralized and used as a method of constraint, and basically a kind of narrowing of possibility, which is implicit already in the self-fulfilling prophecy strategy that I mentioned with regard just to these apparently superficial things like color and textile selection in the 1920s fashion industry. I think what we haven't said, and you're pointing to very usefully via the work of Mark Fisher, who, by the way, is a very interesting British theorist, and Mark and I were talking about the fact that he actually took his own life partly because of his analysis of this futureless future, as it's been described. And so it gets very personal, this set of questions. It's not just an abstract theological, secular, theoretical exercise. It's something people feel very deeply in their bones. And the thing that we maybe haven't stressed enough, although we've talked a little bit about gender and race, is that class is a very important variable in this equation. And because we are talking about the operations of capital, necessarily futurology is itself a kind of cultural capital that is applied and can be weaponized. And again, if the book has a kind of ethical stance, is to push against that and to lift up the voices of futurologists who didn't have General Motors at their disposal or funding their exercise of imagination, and yet somehow still laid claim on the future that was to come. So I think it's a great place to leave it, really, because it shows you that the other great virtue of futurology, and Mark Fisher would be a good example of this, someone who's basically coming out of the ranks of music criticism and achieves this incredible intellectual influence, especially in the UK, from a very small base. Or, think of Ursula Le Guin, think of Samuel Delany, who you know so well. These people had an amazing impact on countless readers and listeners' lives, purely from the force of their own imagining. And that's really what futurology does have to still to promise us. Before we wrap up, I do want to finally explain the catering. So this is an amazing, well, as you can see, it's a gingerbread geodesic dome. We haven't really talked about Buckminster Fuller, but this is our little nod to Bucky.
That's my fault, because Bucky Fuller gives me hives.
Yeah, and everybody always talks about Bucky Fuller, so he's in the book, but it's great that we're accessing him purely through edible form here. So this is by my great friend Diane Bromberg, who's over there, and you can ask her about this afterwards, but she has a new company that's called futuregift.com, so future-gift.com, and you can order your own gingerbread geodesic dome and have it delivered to any function or domestic interior you like. And what we're now going to do is, well, I'm going to go to the back and sign books if you care to have that done for you. But I'm going to break open the dome, and then you are all invited to come and have a piece. And the goal here, folks, is that there's no dome left at the end of this. So don't be shy. Come along, give it a good bash, eat whatever comes off. Diane will come over and help. And Diane, thank you so much for bringing this incredible centerpiece to the proceedings. I really appreciate it.